will study from a lesson in the study of 10 Sefirot with Rabash, the study of 10 Sefirot, Volume 1, Part 4. We are in the questions and answers to the topics. Answer 106, please.
106. Why is there no limitation in the 10 Sefirot of the Rosh? There they say that there is no limitation. Limitation means clothing in vessels measured by the measure of the coarseness, no more and no less. Hence, the rejection of the screen was only in potential, in the Rosh, much less clothing. It is they're only in potential, and there's no disclosure of any limitation here whatsoever. So he asked in 106, why is there no limitation in the 10 Sefirot of the Rosh? So first we have to understand what limitation is. Limitation, it's limited as much as it can receive. It can't receive without any limits. There's a limit. What is the limit? Whatever he can aim from its coarseness to be in order to bestow. That's what it can receive. And the rest, no. So according to that, if we say that there was a limitation, but he will take it up to here he can receive, and no more. So the general rejection is only in force. And the reception is also only in force. We can say also the opposite. Because what he wants to receive only in force and potential, so we have to say it this way. What is the Rosh of the degree that we learned? Malchut of Rosh makes a calculation. As much as it wants to receive, what it could receive, and still didn't receive anything. So it made a calculation of what it could receive and what it didn't receive yet. If it didn't receive yet, why didn't it receive anything yet? Now it's thinking how much it could receive. So we have to think. There is rejection. What do you start from? What's written here? What's difficult for me? So look again at what he's asking about. Why is there no limitation? Why was there no limitation in the 10 Sefirot of the Rosh? So he comes and says this. Limitation means clothing in the vessels. I get with a certain limit. So he said, I only get it in force. Why? Hence the rejection of the screen was only in potential in the Rosh. Whatever I rejected was in potential. So that's why it's less clothing. So it's a bit difficult because it should have said the opposite. Why is it only rejecting in potential? because he still didn't receive in potential. You can't scrutinize what came first and what came later. He extended the light and did not want to receive it. Why? Because first he wanted to calculate. We find that when it calculated, it still didn't receive. That's why we say that once it finished calculating, it didn't receive yet. So the rejection was only in potential, didn't receive anything. Also, what it did receive was in potential. It still didn't actually receive anything. After the decision, as much as it knows, as much as he can receive, then he will receive it in practice. So we see that in the Rosh, there's not much to speak about. The rejection was actual and not the reception, the actual reception. You know what he's asking? That he rejected it in force or in potential. And potential didn't want to receive it. Why do we...
Rejection in potential.
Rejection and potential. We can say this, that if we're speaking after the restriction, he mentions a screen. What is a screen? Two things at once. On one hand, I receive. On the other hand, I don't receive. Restriction and potential, or an actual, you could say that if it's something that it receives in the Rosh, so it's restriction and potential, that's called restriction in the actual. But we speak on the positive side, on what it received. We say that positive means a screen, the head of the degree, meaning reception. So there's a question, did he receive or not? Because the force of the restriction is there in potential. So there's nothing to discuss then. But what I am saying is, if he had reflected light from below upward, that he rejects it and calculates what yes, what no, we find what is from below upward, that it will receive. And we say, when it ascends from below, from Malchut Keter, for example, then we say that the screen expanded from Malchut of Rosh below, from above downward. So there's two things here. He says part he will receive, and part he won't receive. So we find that what he received, what he didn't receive is only in forces. So I wanted to say, since the clothing was in force, the rejection was in force. Or as it's written, that whatever was clothed in potential is also called rejection in potential. I'm not speaking about the restriction, I'm speaking about the screen.
Since it was in potential, not in the regular.
The restriction, he didn't mention it, so I also don't want to mention it. The restriction, you can say it wasn't actual, but the screen, it depends on what it did receive. That's why the clothing was in potential, and the rejection was also in potential. 107. Question. From which point begins the recognition of the limitation? Answer. From the time the exit of the lights from Peh, from above downward to the Tabul, it is not apparent before the time of the return of the lights to the emanator. For now, the existence of the clothing of the coarseness began, and the coarseness and the direct light within it were of the same merit, until there was no distinction between the clothed and the clothing before the direct light returned to the emanator. It is so because the coarseness remained below, without light, and the limitation in the coarseness and the judgment in her became apparent. What was the question? 107. From which point begins the recognition of the limitation? There's recognition in force. There's a recognition in actual, and there's awareness of the limitation, that the coarseness limits that you can't receive it because it's the opposite value of the light. So that recognition, when is it apparent? So he says, on behalf of the Te'amim, that the light was shining in the vessels because of equivalence of form, then the vessel was not apparent, because they were both in equivalence of form. So there's no difference between the clothed and the clothing and the one who clothes. But when the screen started refining and the light departed from the vessel, phase 4, let's say, that the coarseness couldn't aim in order to bestow, and the coarseness is called the vessel of reception. So phase 3 departed, and then phase 3 was apparent because the coarseness was revealed, meaning it remained in darkness. Why? Because of the coarseness. That's called a limitation. There's already a recognition of that limitation. What was apparent? That the coarseness didn't let the abundance illuminate because of the oppositeness between them. When does that happen? Specifically, when the lights return to the emanator. If so, there's phase 3. Limitation and potential, that's Malchut of Rosh. Limitation in practice is Malchut of Guf. And knowing the limitation is when the lights return to the emanator. Now let's look again at 107. From which point begins the recognition of the limitation? Answer. From the time the exits of the lights from the Peh, from above downward to the Tabul. So we say that there's a limitation, but what? It's not apparent. When is it apparent? Before the time of the return of the lights to the emanator, specifically in the departure. For now, before the departure, it would shine on behalf of the Te'amim. The existence of the clothing of the coarseness began. So the coarseness would clothe the light, and the coarseness, the will to receive, and the direct light within it were of the same merit. On the coarseness, the reflected light was in order to bestow. So just as the direct light wants to bestow, the coarseness with reflected light that rides upon it wants to bestow, until there was no distinction between the clothed and the clothing because of the equivalence of form. Before the direct light returned to the emanator. It is so because then, after the direct light returned to the emanator, then the coarseness remained below, without light. Why? Because it's coarseness, that's why the light departed. And the limitation in the coarseness and the judgment in her became apparent. The coarseness, that's what he limits. And there's a judgment that he can't receive in order to receive, because then the light will depart. So we find before the lights return to the emanator, this limitation that the coarseness once was still not apparent. That is, then the vessels become apparent, that it wasn't like that before the lights departed. That's why we learn that the roots of all the vessels come from Parzuf Galgalta. What's written in 108? Why is the phase where the coupling occurs considered the lowest phase? We always say that the last phase is lost. What is the last phase? The lower. So he says, the place where the coupling happens, that is the lower one. Let's see the answer. Because the coupling made there, the coupling by striking. By the screen that pushes the light back and does not let it expand from it and below. Thus the light ends on that phase, which is why it is considered the last phase, or the bottom phase. So what's the question and what is the answer? The answer is, why does he always mention that the last phase or the low phase as a place of the coupling? He says that the last phase was lost. He couldn't perform a coupling by striking there. So he asked, why is that called the last phase, lowest one? And he asked, what is the coupling? Coupling by striking. So he says that from it and above, from Malchut and above, there's still choice to receive in order to bestow, so that he will receive. From it and below, the control of the Malchut, what it will receive will be in order to receive, so it doesn't want to receive. So we find up to here, where is up to here? Coupling by striking on the screen. We find that the last phase, when he says up to here, it says it can't receive. Only on three phases. So then the coupling would be only on three phases. So what is the last phase? Only three of coarseness, and Parzuf Sag will be on the last phase just until phase 2 and no more. So we find that why is that called the last phase? He asks the question, why is the last phase the place where the coupling happens? Because that's where the screen is. Now let's go inward. It'll be easier to understand why I'm saying that the last phase is the place of the coupling. 108. Because the coupling is made there by the screen that pushes the light back and does not let it expand from it and below. Thus, the light ends on that phase, meaning on the screen, which is why it is considered the place of the coupling, the last phase from the bottom phase. 109. Why are the 10 Sefirot incorporated in 5 phases? He writes, since there are only 5 phases, he explains that we don't have anything except for those 5 phases, which are 10 Sefirot. Since Zerampin is included of 6 Sefirot, and together it's 10. 110. What are the 10 Sefirot below the tabul? They're only reflected light, without direct light. They receive only a minute illumination from the direct light, as female light. What is the female light? Which receives and does not bestow. These 10 Sefirot are considered 10 phases of Siyum, where each of them ends in its corresponding Sefirah in the 10 Sefirot of the general Partzuf. What's written here? He asks which light illuminates below the tabul. First of all, we need to know what is below the tabul. We need to know, since in the Rosh of the degree, Malchut of the Rosh, there were 2 phases. Phase 1 is called what it could receive in order to bestow, that it will receive. What it cannot aim in order to bestow, that it won't receive. What was in the Rosh in potential was revealed later in the Guf in actual. We say, what it could receive in order to bestow is called from Petel to the Tabul. When it reaches the part that it can't intend in order to bestow, called receiving in order to receive, so she says, I do not want to receive.